Hi, and welcome back to my channel, Imagining a Philosophy of Star Citizen. For those of you who are stumbling on this video for the first time, you haven't seen any of the other ones, not that there are that many, but this video is a discussion about the philosophical puzzle of how a single mental activity, namely imagination, can be both transcendent and instructive at the same time. I guess I did not need to add that at the same time. But anyway, if this is your first time with us, I do recommend that you go back and watch part 1 of Imagining a Philosophy of Star Citizen. In this current video, we will be covering with more depth the equivocation solution to the puzzle of imaginative use. According to it, the way we explain how the one mental state of imagination can be used for both destructive and transcendent uses is because philosophers equivocate between different senses of the imagination. One helpful way to understand the philosophical discipline is, let's go back a little bit. Let's start at the beginning. Well, not all the way at the beginning, but pretty close to it. So, how do we understand philosophy? That's pretty far back, I would say. Well, one helpful way to understand the philosophical discipline, or the discipline of philosophy, which means the love of wisdom, philosophia, is to first recognize how enduring philosophical questions have been divvied up into sub-disciplines. These are often presented as various puzzles. These puzzles include the domains of metaphysics, which are questions about the nature of reality, or time, or substance, or material. A well-known question in this genre, but then maybe this is epistemology too. But anyway, a well-known question in this genre includes, for instance, St. Anselm's ontological argument. Here, God. So let's imagine for a moment God. What is God? Well, by definition, God is a being greater than any being that can be deceived. This is what Anselm is going to say. Then he's going to further say that if you can conceive of such a being, and remember that if it's greater than any being that can be conceived, that means that this being is going to be omniscient. That means all-knowing, he knows everything. Omnipotent, so this being is all-powerful. And omnibenevolent, so meaning that this being is perfectly good. Then this is by definition God. You have just conceived of God. However, remember that this argument, and this is an important point, this argument is an argument in defense of the existence of God. Now, so let's table the question of whether God exists or God does not exist. Many of you probably do not believe that God exists. So St. Anselm is going to say, okay, so whether you believe that God exists or not, you can imagine or you can conceive of what such a being would possibly be, right? And this is where the greater than none other than which being can be conceived, or whatever it's called. And so here you're imagining or you're conceiving of it being this omniscient, omnipotent, benevolent, and by definition that is God, right? But however, the second premise asks you to consider the non-existence of such a being. So here you have a choice. You can conceive of one being who has all the omnis and exists, and your other option is to conceive of a being that has all the omnis but does not exist. But this is where we run into a conceptual contradiction. According to Anselm, and maybe to us, existence is greater than non-existence. One way to think of this is to think of properties, and to think of properties that different substances have whether those substances are people or water bottles. And a property would be something like the color. So I'm looking at a water bottle, and it's got a property of being blue, for instance. So existence in this articulation is a property, right? And so there's one being, the being that's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and does have the property of existence. But then there is another being who's all the omnis, but does not have the property of existence. And you might ask yourself, well, which being is greater? And Anselm is going to say, well, obviously the being that has the property of existence is greater than the being that does not have the property of existence. And so if you're trying to imagine a being that's greater than any being that can be conceived, but does not have the property of existence, well, then you've not conceived of God. You're conceiving of something else. Necessarily, in order to conceive of God, it has to have all the omnis, or this conception has to have all the omnis, plus the property of existence. Anyway, so that's a philosophical puzzle, right? There's this logical claim, and if you accept the premises, then you have to accept the conclusion, which is God exists, right? But there are many people who don't believe in God. So are they illogical? Are they inconsistent in their beliefs? Is their reason faulty? I'll let you think about that. Anyway, therefore it is impossible. So there are questions in epistemology as well, puzzles, if you will. And these include questions about the nature of knowledge. What is knowledge? How do we have it? How do we recognize it? Value theory, which are questions about the nature of what we value or what is valuable, what is normatively valuable, right? What should we, what ought we value, including these questions are those about ethics, right, good, etc., aesthetics, beauty, etc., and so on. For a helpful outline, it might be helpful if you peruse Phil papers and just click on the link. Given that we are talking about games, we might be asking questions about art, the beautiful, and representation. Since oftentimes we think games are beautiful, we think that they are examples of good art, or can be examples of bad art. We think that they represent items in the real world, or maybe even conceptual items, or even imaginative ones. Imagined ones. But while this is plausible, and there are very, very good discussions about video games and video game properties, including, among other discussions about the nature of the beautiful, this video is not any of those. Okay? Within the discipline, so what is this video? Within the disciplines of metaphysics and epistemology, like I've mentioned before, there are questions about the nature of internal mental states. I guess a question about metaphysics can include questions about the correlation of mental states with brain states, if you make a distinction between the two, and philosophers usually do, with brain states being the physical state of matter that comprises your brain, and mental states being the activity that goes on inside the brain, which often includes various images of linguistics and semantics and so on and so forth. Now, the one question is whether one directly infers or is entailed by the other. Are mental states distinct from brain states, or are they identical? While it might be appropriate to correlate brain states with mental ones within the domain of philosophy, we still treat the two as distinct from one another. But those are questions for another day, once again. In fact, however, we are getting closer to our original topic, which is the puzzle of imaginative views. I apologize once again for the digression. Now, When speaking of the metaphysics of mental states, it would be helpful to talk about what we mean by mental states. Perhaps you will have already guessed what we mean by mental states, but it is important to be precise and specific. So in the interest of clarity, I will first give some examples. These include desire, belief, and attention, to name but a few. Why is attention a mental state? Well, imagine that your wife is telling you how her day went, which bills are coming due, the friend she met at the gun range, etc. She ends the dialogue with a question, "What's for dinner?" And you respond, "That's nice." Well, you were not paying attention, and now you've been caught, and she calls you out on this. Further, she now has your attention. But what was your state of mind before she had your attention, and what is your state of mind now? What distinguishes the one from the other? What are the necessary sufficient conditions for a mental state being a state of attention or being something else? Further, there are two mental states of concern here, attention and inattention. What qualifies as a mental state of inattention? What does each look like, and what are their natures? This is an interesting question for Star Citizen. For instance, how many times have we failed to pay attention and lost cargo and other valuable loot because of a mental distraction or other? How many of us have run full speed into the salvage vehicle where we were navigating towards and failed to pay attention as we got closer to it? But this question does finally get us closer to the original, and I recognize that this video is taking longer than it needs to, and I apologize. And so yet I digress again. I digress yet again? Yeah. Ultimately, what is it like to fail to pay attention to an imagined scene? Isn't that what we are doing? Imagining that we've just traded valuable currency for an imagined wreck from which we derive valuable cargo and imaginatively sell this cargo for more valuable currency. While I am not in a position to answer that question, a question more near our initial one is, what can our imagining in Star Citizen teach us about the nature of our various mental states, including that of attention? See, I told you we'd get around to it. Inattention and imagination itself. Therefore, perhaps by engaging in imaginative exercises, for instance, those afforded to us in games like Star Citizen, we can better understand important truths about the real world, such as the nature of mental states like imagination, attention, desire, etc. Of course, in looking at questions regarding the nature of a single given mental state like imagination, we can make our job of analyzing such a state easier by once again breaking it up into smaller questions, such as, what are some of the functions of imagination? Here we see two. These include transcendent uses of imagination and instructive uses of imagination. A transcendent use of imagination is one where we are imagining some particular enterprise, for instance, that we are a space trucker. And instructive uses of the imagination is our potential ability to learn what life would be like as a space trucker. Sorry, that's kind of funny. And here we've come around full circle back to our initial question. Namely, how can we have the transcendent use of the imagination, imagining being a space trucker, without the other, learning what life would be like as a space trucker? So from here, then, we will look at our first proposed solution. That solution is the equivocating solution to the puzzle. Here, first of all, once again, we're going to look at this question about imagination and ask, what is imagination? But notice how we skipped over the question about what are mental states. And I think this is kind of important. So initially we said, well, we might be trying to explain what a mental state is. But we've skipped over that question. Maybe a reason why we've done this is because sometimes it is helpful to break up larger questions such as what is a mental state into more manageable ones. These can include questions about what, for instance, when we are asked what a mental state is or what mental states were, the best answers we could give are examples of things we think are mental states. For instance, desire, belief, attention, and of course imagination. Of course there are others. There's a bunch of others, lots of others, like belief and blah blah blah. Anyway, so since the best we could do was give examples of things we think are mental states, it becomes obvious that one way to understand the bigger question about mental states is to explore things that we think are mental states. And that brings us here to the mental state of imagination. So what is imagination? What counts as imagination? And perhaps, and we find some more questions. Namely, so we were asking what is imagination and what counts as imagination, but then we see two possibilities. One is represented by transcendent uses of the imagination, where we're pretending we're a princess or a prince or a space trucker, and another where it's instructive. We're learning about what it's like to be a prince or princess or a space trucker. Here's Kind and Kung in their book, in their collected volume, Knowledge Through Imagination. If there are different senses of imagination in play in philosophical discussion, then perhaps it is imagination in one sense that is responsible for the transcendent use of imagination, while imagination in some other sense is responsible for the instructive use of imagination. Well, we know that it is a mental state, but what is its nature or essence? Here there are many possibilities available to us. This is because many different philosophers have given different answers to this question. And so some of these particular answers are the transcendent use and the instructive use. That's where we got here. That's how we got here. That's why we're here anyway. So this fact about historical treatments of the imagination has been cited as a reason why the puzzle of imaginative use persists. This is called the equivocation solution. According to it, when we focus on the transcendent uses of the imagination, we are talking about one set of proposed natures, while talking about another, we are focusing on the instructive uses. So let's look at some examples. Let's begin with this one example first. So what if history extended beyond mere Earth history? For instance, Star Wars is said to begin eons before human civilization on Earth. The lore regarding the Star Citizen timeline models a similar history. According to it, the recorded history of the Xi'an Empire begins during the Earth year 300,000 BCE. That's a long time ago. However, the in-game events take place in the Earth year 2954, and the player does not play from the perspective of the Xi'an, but rather from that of human society in the current Earth year 2954. And so what this means is that the timeline in Star Citizen is eons more expansive than our own current timeline in the real world. In consequence, those individuals participating in the imaginative enterprise that is Star Citizen are being asked to imagine that 930 years have elapsed from the time they first opened the RSI launcher until the loading screen has finished its cycle and the player presses F and gets quote-unquote out of bed. But there's also extensive documentation detailing many of the other imaginative requirements for successful participation in the Universal Star Citizen. These include the immediate experience of thirst and hunger upon opening one's eyes, perhaps developing a plan for that day in the verse, which might include looking for lucrative bounties or cargo missions. Perhaps they have been saving their UEC credits for a particular ship, and now they finally have enough. Maybe they have been saving the coordinates of a scenic mountain range on Microtech, and they now finally have the real-world time available for them to visit this virtual mountain range. But notice, or this imagined mountain range. But notice here that some imaginations are necessary for participation in a simulation or in the game, while others are contingent on the aims of the player. Is the former a more pure case of imagination, while the latter is not? I cannot avoid imagining that I am experiencing hunger and thirst in the game. There have been many times that I've wanted to. I might be excited about climbing aboard a new ship and traveling to a package location. But then I look to the lower left of my screen and my Mobi glass is telling me that my hydration is at 13%. I try to ignore it because it takes time to source hydration, and I would rather spend that time flying my new ship rather than sourcing hydration, especially given that there are real-world time constraints that place demands on me in addition to the imaginative demands. But if I ignore the image the game is forcing on me, that of being hungry and thirsty, I will be ejected from my desired imaginative state, flying my ship into a new one, namely, from my desired imaginative state, flying my ship into a new one, namely waking up in a hospital bed. But does this aforesaid imaginative activity differ from the following? Waking up at Port Elisar and flying my new ship to New Babbage to meet up with some friends. Meeting up with my friends at New Babbage is not necessary to participate in the imaginative activity that is Star Citizen, while eating and drinking is. Some imaginative activities are contingently necessary then. A contingently necessary imaginative activity is an imaginative activity that is necessary for an additional imaginative activity. And notice how eating and drinking might qualify as such. In order to fly my Aurora, I need to first eat and drink. However, there are better examples, for instance earning UEC credits by doing various tasks in order to buy a cargo ship that further enables me to transport cargo from one location to another. One way we might define such distinctions is through the philosophical literature on imagination. The distinction is between imagination from the inside. Well, the distinction of concern here, immediately here, is imagination from the inside or imagining from the inside, and imagination or imagining from the outside. Kind and Kung ask us to imagine ourselves skiing versus imagining ourselves having frozen cheeks on account of skiing. Well, once again, I think that Star Citizen can present us with the better example. We might focus on our internal states of desire here. Internally, I have a desire to race in a canyon on Del Mar, but it seems that my character has an ulterior desire to eat and drink, don a helmet when in a low oxygen environment such as space or a non-terraformed planet, etc. In part, there is a connection between my character's state of desire and my own, namely they are contingent. For every internal state of desire that I experience, fly among the stars, dip my hands into a stream, meet friends in a bar on New Babbage, my character develops a contingent set of desires. The way Kind and Kung articulate this development is by pointing out that an important distinction regarding imagination from the inside versus that from the outside plays a role in predicting how we react to given scenarios. My desire to witness firsthand the corrosive effects of the ocean on Crusader will enable my friends to predict that I am likely to fly to Crusader. Therefore, it may at first seem that the equivocation view is highly plausible. It has some force behind it. The fact that I can make predictions about what one is likely to do given a particular imaginative activity, say eat and drink, infers that the instructive uses of imagination rely on imagining from the inside. However, but what happens when we consider that the point of imaginative activity is to be able to pan the game camera out to the third-person view and see what one would look like if he or she were to stand on the shoreline of a maximally polluted ocean? This is imagining from the outside, and yet it still might be instructive. Or let's consider the in-game feature that allows us to try on items such as armor and fashionable clothes prior to purchasing them with UEC credits. I might do so to learn what they look like on my character. Each of these examples seem to suggest that both imagining from the inside and from the outside can be instructive or transcendent or both. As such, the equivocation view is not really helpful for solving the problem of imaginative use. since each of these mental activities can be both instructive and transcendent still at the same time.